without further ado, this is definitely not about me today. We've got two awesome celebs of the CCF movement here. So I'm really excited to introduce them. And I would love to have you both kick us off. Before we get into the meat of the CCF stuff, I know everyone would love to learn a little bit more about both of your stories. So Michelle, if you want to go first, I'd love to hear, obviously, if you can introduce yourself, what you're up to these days, but also, a couple layers of your identity that are most important to you, and where this story and love story with having an impact and helping others in this way started for you.
Yeah, I wasn't nervous to do my intro until you said celeb, and I was like, I've never been, called a celeb before. But I always say it's funny, if the nonprofit sector had a celebrity, I personally think it would be Boulay. Like, he's like our nonprofit celebrity, So so it's funny to be called that. But in terms of intro, I'm so glad to be here with everyone. My name is Michelle Flores Friend, pronouns she, her, aya, and I am, during my 8 to 5 day, the Chief Development Officer at the One Star Foundation, which is based in Austin, Texas. So if you're calling in from Texas or Austin or, around that area, let me know. I'd love to connect with you. And I'm also involved in, on the side, several other movements, including community-centric fundraising, which we'll obviously talk about more here today. But just kind of giving a quick shout out to also Donor Participation Project, which is a virtual group that really convenes on LinkedIn, but there's meetups and other fun things that you can synchronize with people in the group. So shout out to Donor Participation Project and anyone who's joining from DPP, and also very involved with AFP on the global level, but also in the Austin chapter. I guess, to your question, Mitch, about, where did a focus on giving back or philanthropy or development start? I think that for me, when I was in high school was when 9/11 happened. So it kind of gives you a little bit of my age there. And I remember, I think I was like a sophomore or junior, somewhere around there. And as anyone who was also, remembers that event, I think you'll remember where you were, what you were doing, who you're with, kind of thing. And for me, being younger, that was one of the first world events that really smacked you in the face that had ever happened to me. And I remember, of course, being confused and devastated, but I also felt for a couple of days after that, people were just shocked and traumatized, and I was too. But I think I somehow quickly moved to I want to do things to help. And so what I did was I organized a very small fundraiser in my high school, which was just small town Texas, very, very few people there. But I just felt I'm devastated as well, and I have to do something. And that was my way of doing something. And I think I've always kind of just gravitated towards philanthropy in that regard of it's my way to help people who are helping people. And I think that's what really led me to the field.
Thanks so much for sharing all that, Michelle. And thank you for everything you do, as we say here at Bond, wearing all of the hats. It's really amazing how much you're contributing in all these different spaces. So thanks for joining us today. Marissa, would you like to go next?
Thank you. It's tough to follow Michelle. She's quite an act to follow. And I have to just give the disclaimer that Michelle and I have worked together and know each other and adore each other. So you guys will just forgive our familiar way of speaking to each other, because we have a deep mutual affection here. My journey, my name is Marissa DeSales, and I'm laughing at myself because somehow on this particular profile that I'm on, my first name is misspelled, and there is actually only one S in Marissa. So I don't know how that even happened. Maybe my husband was using this. No idea.
Marissa, anyway, I was worried that we misspelled your name in all of our other content. So that just made me feel a lot better.
I don't even understand, and I'm not on a new computer. But anyway, so there's that. I am born and raised Californian, and I was born in Southern California and settled in Northern California in what's known as Sacramento, which is actually unceded land that belongs to the Nisenan people. And I honor them and their land, which I'm thankful to have the opportunity to steward by paying them rent every month. And I would encourage anybody that lives on unceded tribal land to research your local tribe and pay them for the use of the wonderful land that sustains all of us. I fell accidentally into the nonprofit world. My early career was mainly characterized by indecision. I temped my way through 4 cities right out of college and discovered that marketing was really the only part of the corporate world that I had any attraction to, because it was the only place where they were having any fun. And my communication skills and kind of artistic inclination was kind of partly filled there. But a few years in, I was working on getting a master's degree in interdisciplinary arts education. And I just had a change of heart. And I thought I really need to get out of the corporate world and go where the people are doing some real good. And so I worked with a friend of mine in the Bay Area during the .com boom and learned web design and all of those sorts of things, working with primarily small local nonprofits in the Bay Area. And then life happened. I had a son. I moved back to Sacramento where I have family, and started working for a local nonprofit doing therapeutic horseback riding and horse-assisted therapy for kids and adults with special needs. And was a marketing and fundraising department of 1. I started as the volunteer coordinator. They had no fundraiser. They had no real fundraising or marketing efforts. And I went in determined to change all of that. And I think I did. And 12 years in, of course, COVID happened. And being a direct service organization with a very medically fragile population was kind of a no-go. So our program had to stop. And while I was sidelined, we watched the public murder of George Floyd in front of our eyes, and the tepid response from the nonprofit sector inspired a deep and abiding rage in me that I didn't know I was harboring. And I poured it into an essay that later became a published piece on the Community-Centric Fundraising Hub. And I quite honestly had zero intention of showing it to anyone because the way I read it, it was a career killer, and because it was honest and it said some things that I had been quietly feeling for a long time as a person who lives in a racialized, marginalized identity working in the nonprofit world. And that's how my journey brought me to the community-centric fundraising movement. I had been following Voulez, as many people do, on his blog Nonprofit AF, and had been really honestly clinging to that blog as a kind of lifeline while working in the industry, a sort of a weekly refresh and recheck, and finally an honest voice in the sector, I felt. And so, of course, I jumped at the chance to get involved in the effort, and the deeper that I've fallen into it, it's now basically become my whole personality. And I spend my time now as a consultant working with 2 groups, one with primarily Black and person of color led small emerging organizations with basic fundraising, all of the things, and with established larger organizations looking to include their fundraising in their living of their DEI values. So I mostly go around and speak with folks that work in fundraising or just the nonprofit industry in general, and try to illuminate some of the principles of community-centric fundraising in hopes that people might be able to add it to their practice, or add at least one or more of the tools that are in there to their daily practice of fundraising.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for sharing all those stories and your background. You bring so much to the movement into this conversation, and we've been referencing it a lot and talking about Voulez and CCF. But for those in the conversation who maybe don't have all the background, I'd love to start off Can you give us a little bit of the history of where did CCF start and how did it get going? I don't know if Michelle, if you want to go first, and Marissa, you can add on.
Yes, would love to. So the concepts that you now see as the 10 principles for CCF, which you can find on the CCF website, they really started in organic conversation among fundraisers, and specifically fundraisers of color in the Pacific Northwest. And fundraisers of color in mainly Seattle, but Pacific Northwest, they were having like these conversations about, like as fundraisers do, so any fundraisers on the call, like, like you have like your group of fundraisers that you go to, like when you have problems that you don't know how to figure out, or just, people you want to talk to, or like that nonprofit cohort, like they had that too. And they begin to see like through those conversations, wow, like one, we're facing a lot of similar problems, and two, there are some things that are really wrong with the way that we are approaching philanthropy as like a default method of approaching philanthropy. And so through those conversations, they said, well, I think we need to figure out, like, is it just us, or is this like other people? Like, is this like a Seattle thing, or what's going on? And so they actually organized a survey, and I believe this is 2018. I could be off a year, but they organized a survey where they had over 2,000 respondents from all levels in the nonprofit sector. So director level, manager level, coordinator level, et cetera. And through the responses of that survey, they really found that, okay, there is in fact a lot of things that a donor-centered model, which is like our default fundraising model, is causing. And they created a new model of thinking, which it's like both principles and a framework. So it's like a theory of change and also gives you ways to do things. And that's where the movement started. So the movement continues to be volunteer led. Like there is no leader of the movement. It's very organic. And I'll just have to do a real quick plug for the CCF Slack channel, which obviously is a free platform to use. So if you're interested in the channel and are not on it, definitely like let us know. We can get you connected. There's, I think, 5,600 people on the Slack channel. So really great source of community there. And Marissa, I'm sure there was something I missed there.
Yeah, I'll just pick up kind of where you left off, like timeline wise, right? So after they convened this research and discovered that, oh, surprise, our anecdotal experiences are actually validated by data, they convened a series of BIPOC town halls. And Michelle and I were chatting as we were preparing for this talk today, and we laughed because we had the exact same experience. And it was life-changing because we had neither of us had ever been in a room of exclusively fundraisers of color, ever, okay? And we got into that virtual space and were blown away by, one, the safe space that was created to talk honestly about issues that we face in the sector. And two, the way the whole meeting was organized. It was my first time ever hearing a land acknowledgement, for example. And three, the coalescing of basically just a ragtag bunch of friends, right, in the sector, okay, into a formalized movement with a public-facing hub, and not only public-facing, but a community-centric hub that began with an invitation to generate content, to contribute content, that prioritized the voices of people who have historically been excluded and marginalized, and pushed us to the front and compensated us, right? Like things that are just unheard of, right? Okay. And the movement from then has now evolved. And I'm really pleased that it has not solidified, and I don't think there are any plans to solidify into a really formal, a 501c3 structure. It's a loose movement. It doesn't have an organized leader. What it has is a council. It began with a founding council and is now in the process of transitioning to a global council that has been very democratically, sourced and very, very thoughtfully designed. I was part of the team that helped design the whole succession process, and just the level of thought and care and consideration that went into the process of designing succession from this initial group of friends to a truly global represented, leadership group was just further proof to me that this is about living your principles. This is about doing the hard work. This is about not shying away from the hard conversations.
And what an amazing case study in movement building. I mean, almost 6,000 people engaging in a Slack community. And I know the reach of the blog and content is even so much further. So kudos both of you to everything you're driving and sending these important messages home. I also know that donor-centric fundraising, as you mentioned, Michelle, does tend to be such a default and is like what people that are steeped in the industry are so used to. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions or myths that you encounter when you talk about community-centric fundraising as opposed to a donor-centric fundraising model, Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one to leap off with here is they're not a strict dichotomy. It's not one, you have to pick one or the other. There are areas of overlap, but I also feel like battling them against this or this, A or B, that's an unhealthy dynamic too, which one, it's not true, but two, I think that that's very unhealthy. And I always try to start my talks by saying, that's kind of like a false opposition that we're setting up if you think of it that way. So don't think of it that way. So that's my first thing. But I think also with community-centric fundraising, I really there was a fundraiser who I look up to a lot named Armando Zumaya. And he said one time in a talk, I heard him say, love the principles of community-centric fundraising, love it. But and he's a career fundraiser. He's been fundraising for 30 plus years. And he said, but a lot of this isn't new to me, right? As a fundraiser of color, I've been doing this for a long time. I love that you guys are doing it under a framework, but this isn't completely new and gonna blow my mind. This is what I've been doing my whole career. And so I always love that he said that, because I think that that's something we need to be reminded of. There's a lot of fundraisers out here who have been doing this for 30 years, and they have put community first in their careers, and they should be recognized for that. I think community-centric fundraising is a nice framework that kind of pulls it all together, but the ideas themselves are not brand new.
I love that.
I think that's a really, really important point, Michelle. And I mean, there's considerable overlap in this movement with other movements, with grassroots fundraising, with community building, with social justice movements. And all of that is by design, quite honestly. It's not, it wasn't designed to be, completely new and different. But unfortunately, I think that the nonprofit industry has escaped a lot of the scrutiny that corporations have had to endure as consumers become more and more conscious about their choices, started demanding, through boycotts and other community actions, that corporations follow certain standards, right? Or have a certain diversity, equity, and justice type goals. Nonprofits, we've been sort of assumed to be doing the good work, right? And so therefore kind of above any of that sort of scrutiny. And I think that's been a mistake. And I think that this movement is about shining a light on some of the practices that we just take for granted because they're successful in creating revenue, without considering that perhaps we can expand the definition of what a fundraiser does, that perhaps a fundraiser is more than just a salesperson for the mission, that perhaps a fundraiser can be involved in the execution of social justice, that perhaps the fundraising department is not immune from us living out our values honestly and transparently and with accountability, right? So to me, that's kind of the biggest, I don't know if you would call it a misconception, but for me, it's a slightly different lens to look at the work that we're always doing and figure out how we can do it a little bit better, right? With a little bit less harm, right? It's not throw everything out the window, slap all your donors in the face, right? Forget everything, right? It's not that. But what it is we can tell stories of impact while honoring our story givers as much as we honor our donors, right? It's about, we can choose hiring practices that lift up communities so that our board and our development staff look more like the communities that we're serving, right? It's about incremental changes. It's about recentering the power balance in the relationships that we call ourselves trying to build as fundraisers, right? And to me, that's really the crux of it, is a critical reexamination of this work that we do, and putting it into a broader perspective.
One thing that I'd love to just lift up from what you said, Marissa, too, was success. You mentioned because it's been successful in the past. And I think a lot of what you're saying is like redefining what success means, because if you are only looking through one lens of what success is, you're kind of missing the point of your mission. And it's similar, like you gave the corporate example, where people are saying, okay, it's not just about profit. It's not just about funds raised. We should be examining performance across a number of variables. And by the way, just because it's your version of success in the past, maybe you could be raising way more if you were better connected with your community, right? Like it's not, we're not saying just raise less. That's definitely not the goal of the movement.
Right. Yeah, Michelle, I'm sure you saw one of the most recent articles on the Hub, highlighting some of the successes. Maria, I want to say Rosa, maybe I'm getting the last name wrong, but anyway, she talks about, you know, they revamped their whole approach. They ended some things that were popular with donors. They changed everything. They had some challenges. They had some hiccups, but overall, their fundraising was up. They had tried something completely new. It was completely, people were gaga over it, and they had ended up raising more unrestricted dollars, more money overall, and they had broadened their reach by doing something that conventional folks might think was completely insane.
Yeah, this reminds me of, I had a CEO tell me one time that, so, you know, like in nonprofits, you have like the chief development officer, you'll have like the CFO, maybe the COO, maybe like a chief communications officer. But he said, I really always felt like with the CDO role, that position was the position that was easiest for me to judge if they were being successful in their job or not, because it's like either you met your revenue or you didn't. But like with the CFO or COO, it was like maybe they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, maybe they weren't. Like those metrics were a lot more gray in his mind. And I had like thought about that comment so many times over the years, because you know, my response to him was, it's never that simple. Like if you think measuring fundraising, you're just looking at the annual revenue raised. I mean, like you don't even think about how you raise that money. I mean, it was just like, oh, like that is such an illuminating conversation for me, because it really illustrates like how I think also this is a leadership problem of like, we're looking at very black and white metrics on like, are we being successful? And I just thought like, you know, I think probably most CEOs think that too. Like the CDO role may be the easiest one to gauge because there's like a number associated with it, like baked in, you know, and I think that's a lot of our problem, if not majority of our problem.
Yeah, and I'd love to, those are amazing examples. I know more will keep coming up. You've mentioned a few times the core principles. There are 10 of them. Everyone, I encourage you to go read them. We'll include the link on the page too as well on the CCF site. We probably don't have time to go through all 10 of them, but I wanted to call out a couple. And if folks in the audience have questions on these two, please jump in the chat and share them. The very first one, I'm sure it's number one for a reason. Fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. Can you explain why this is such a high priority, even if, and maybe especially if, your organization isn't explicitly a racial justice or social justice organization? Marissa, if you want to kick this one off.
Yeah, it really is at the heart of it kind of in that principle informs all of the rest of the principles. And I sometimes will tell people before I start explaining all of the 10 principles that, listen, if you don't believe that systemic racism exists, you may want to just exit now. Right? So it does assume a certain framework and a certain starting point. And I think that there are some organizations out there for whom this would be entirely inappropriate. Okay. And I say that because I know that there are organizations out there whose sole purpose is to promote racist terrorism, right? Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, right? I don't know if they're formal organizations, but you know what I mean? And so unless you're in that group who is explicitly espousing racism, you've got to be anti-racist. Okay, because there is no room for gray area in that. You can be racist, you can be on the process towards becoming an active anti-racist, or you can be actively anti-racist, right? And so grounding everything in that basic set of reality, I think, provides a foundation for all of the rest of the ideas that are in the principles. And I think it's important for every org that is not explicitly racist in its purpose to be actively anti-racist. And this assumes that, and that's a pretty core assumption, and it won't resonate with everyone. And there are naysayers. There are even folks that are, actively backlashing against the movement, which I see as a sign of the movement's success personally. But if you don't believe that, you're not going to really believe any of the other principles. And so it provides just a really wide base that any org that is not an actively racist organization can use as a starting point.
Yeah, beautifully said. I don't know, Michelle, you had more to add there.
No, I mean, I think it just underscored what you just already said was we can't just have fundraising practices in play and then hope, like, cross our fingers, maybe it produces equity and social justice. Like, we have to kick off with that being our intention, like out of the gate, like that's what we're striving for. And I think that's a new mind pivot for most of us.
Yeah, and I think it's both symbolic and effective to lead your principles with that, because I think that's what you would like to see mirrored by most participating organizations as well. Another
Absolutely.
principle.
Well, I just sort of add on that more, Mitch, but I think that the more work that organizations can do to really utilize all of their human resources to enact their mission and live their values, right? I think that they've been leaving us out, honestly. I think that the EDs and the board chairs consider us just little revenue engines, right? Not considering the fact that fundraisers are often the main face, the main voice, the main words of an organization, the main contact that it has with the public. And in that, there lies a great deal of power. And how we wield that power matters.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for calling that out, Marissa. One other topic area that I know is a big component of CCF, which is the first word, community, and how individual organizations' missions are not as important as the collective community. I wish I could like paint this on the walls like more, because I think especially for fundraisers, it gets competitive. You're trying to hit these goals, you like doing anything you can for your organization and get, hit those marks. Like have you seen people successfully move to a more collective mindset cross organization, especially in smaller markets where it can feel a lot more competitive?
Yeah, it's funny, Mitch. This is one of my favorite principles. I call it the get over yourself principle. Okay. Get over yourself, get over your
that
mission.
on a t-shirt.
All of us are doing the super important work. and it's all super vital, and that's fantastic, but get over yourself, right? Your mission doesn't make or break your community. Okay, all of us working together in our community makes or breaks our community. There isn't anyone or that their mission, if they disappeared tomorrow, would be the end of our society as we know it, right? Right. So coming from that, because we're taught, mission overall and mission, right? Gotta like serve the mission. When we take a little bit of a step back from that and go, mission is a part of community. We are a part of a greater whole. It's humbling, right? As humbling as, I don't know if anybody else here is a star nerd, but I watched some of the new images of the JWST and seeing in incredible detail just how teeny tiny and insignificant we actually are in the grand scheme of things is, for me, a very, very useful mental exercise that informs the energy that I bring to everything else I'm going to do today. Right. And so for me, it's very analogous to that. My favorite example of people living this principle is local community giving days. Because on those, I have seen, I'm very active with our local giving day here, and I've seen some incredible acts of collaboration, of like sort of self-deprecation, right, in service of the greater whole, cheerleading, like just that sense of we are linking hands and raising our community up together, as opposed to we're squid gaming for like $10 from the local foundation, right? That's where our real power lies. That's where our real potential for impact lies, in that sense of collaboration. And that gives me absolute chills.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite principles, that individual organizations are not as important as the collective community, because coming from a conservation fundraising background and in the conservation space, like we're very used to thinking about and talking about things like in ecosystems. And so you can't often just isolate one variable. Like, I just want to like protect this river here. It's like, but what's coming up from downstream? Like everything's connected, and you see that so easily in nature. But that truth also carries over into our nonprofit missions, right? Like, even though we don't see each other as connected and influencing each other, we are living in that kind of world. And so I think the more we can adopt that mindset and get comfortable living in that mindset, the more impactful we're going to be. I know Marissa and I have talked about, when we were talking or geeking out about our annual report conversation, like we would love to see annual reports that are not just for one organization. Like, say, for example, you had like a watershed, or a mountain range. Doesn't have to be environmental, but these are the ones that come to my mind first. And that you had like 5 organizations that all work in this watershed produce an annual report for that region. Like, that's like where we need to be getting to, instead of just like, let's all individually do our own thing.
Wow, imagine how beautiful like a report like that could look. Oh my gosh.
And also,
right?
Marissa, I've been thinking, this could be our next article, Marissa. I've been thinking too about like joint strategic planning. Like we have like our strategic planning sessions, like one nonprofit at a time. Like, why can't we get into a room together in community and say, this is what we're going to prioritize for 2022 to 2025. What are you guys doing? Like, who's on base here? Like, who's in this game right now? Like, who's out? Like, we need to like begin to widen our landscape like that. And that can be done. I think it's just a matter of we're not used to doing it.
Well, and somebody needs to fund it too, right? On the philanthropy end, right? Foundations need to be funding that level of collaboration.
Yep.
If the EDs of the biggest, 10 nonprofits in town met annually for their, okay, we're going to hit the top 3 problems in this city. Here in Sacramento, we have an incredible homeless problem, incredible affordable housing problem. We have thousands of people living on the streets, and 800, 900 nonprofits in this town. Like, it's not a lack of organizations. for
Yeah.
sure. Okay, we have, I think, the second highest number of nonprofits per capita behind DC, right? And Sacramento's drowning in nonprofits, and yet there's 7,000 people living on the streets, right? And it's a lack of coordination. It's a lack of collaboration, as you said, like joint strategic planning, not just how are we going to meet the needs of this one client base, but this is a systemic, huge problem. Okay. And I mean, our local government wants to sort of throw millions of dollars into studies, and it's like, you just have to look out the window. They're right there, you know, the family that was doing just fine until one illness or injury caused them to get behind on rent. And now they went from sleeping in their car to all they have is a tent, right? And that's a problem that is a solvable problem, right? There's a vacant home right next to me that's been vacant for 2.5 years because there's some, out of town bank owns it and has zero investment or care for this actual community, right? That's a solvable problem, but it requires deep collaboration at the highest level.
I love that the framing of things as solvable problems too. I think that's really motivating and the right attitude to have in the collective. So thank you for flagging that too, Marissa. One other thing that you've mentioned some about equal value for participation in different folks within the organization and fundraisers and maybe even volunteers. Another one of the principles is time is valued equally as money. I think that's something we can all understand, but I'd love if you have some good context or examples of like common practices for organizations that truly do a good job of creating that equal feeling and treatment of value between all stakeholders and types of contributions. Michelle, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, any organization that does this well has to recognize like there is a collective of people like keep this train going, and we're not just saying the most important people are the donors. I know I've worked in organizations in the past, and there's a lot of you on this call as well, that like you couldn't do what you do without your volunteers. And I think oftentimes like we don't even like acknowledge our volunteers for what they do. Like they're not at the gala, they're not at the, they're not given recognition on the annual report. And so I think that the number one thing organizations should do is to really think about who's all operating like on this field to make this possible. And it's also your staff, right? Like I think staff often feel that we give way more attention and care to donor treatment than we do to staff treatment. And, it's a matter of not prioritizing one group over another. And I do think that you can kind of see how those conversations shake out internally through your annual report, like which Marissa and I can talk about later because we wrote a whole article about annual reports and we totally geeked out from many conversations about the highs and lows of annual reports. But yeah, that's what first comes to mind for me.
Yeah, it truly does. I too have worked with an organization that relied completely on volunteer support for absolute program, maintenance and running. And I think that we take volunteers for granted, and not just program volunteers. We can sometimes take board service for granted, but I think that the key to this principle, where this really hits home for me, is when we're thinking about how we include the community, how we include certain pieces of the community, and the attention and recognition that we give to them. The retired volunteer that gives every Monday from 10 a.m. to noon and has done for the past 10 years, right, should be valued equally as the corporate sponsor person that comes in with the big fake check. Because at the end of the day, that fake check didn't cost that company, that person, anything, right? It's a tax write-off. They don't care. They're hoping they're getting their little picture in the paper. Whereas Doris, okay, who has been getting up every Monday and foregoing all of the other things she could do with her Monday morning, just gets a quick, oh, hi, Doris, good to see you again, as opposed to the corporate person gets a whole shenanigans and basically a party thrown for them. And it's it's alienating, and it's pushing away some of our, particularly some of our elders in our communities of color, because they may not have the financial resources to give, but they have the expertise, they have the connections to the community that are absolutely invaluable, because Doris on Sundays, right, runs the church supper and has an audience of 250 people. And if you happen to tell her that your org needs some new blankets for your kitten rescue, she's going to tell 250 people, and you're going to get a pallet of blankets on your doorstep, which your corporate sponsor could never. Right? is where I see that really coming in. When we start to value people's time and expertise, and stories is my other thing. We have to value our story owners the way that we value our major gifters, because when folks are allowing us to use their story, their image, their success in our marketing materials, we need to treat that as though it's a major gift, because it is. Right? It's worth to that person more than that $10,000 check from a corporation by far.
So have you seen this in practice where executive directors or leadership positions that are plugged into this principle will intentionally kind of split their time and attention to make sure, like, I'm spending time with volunteers and spending time with program and like equally, and not overly focused on major donors or corporate sponsors?
Yes, like one thing I think that's super easy if you're not doing this already, is when a lot of us have the practice of like, we'll pull the major gifts for this month or quarter or whatever, and then you'll have like your board and your CEO, your chief development officer, like call these people, reach out, set up coffee meetings, etc. But you're already pulling that list, so you have a system in place to where you're connecting with people, but add other demographics or characteristics to that list, like say volunteers who volunteered 10 times in a row or for a full year, or members who have, been a member for, I don't know, 5+ years, or even first time givers. Like, you got to change that list up to where you're not just prioritizing, okay, like literally, here are the people giving us the most, let's go spend our time on them. Like, just fold in other ways of introducing other people to that list and connect with them as well. I think that's like a super easy way to revamp an existing structure.
And to Marissa's point earlier,
so sorry, Mitch, I keep stepping on you, but I think that's really important, because it speaks to like how we value people at the end of the day, right? And so, are we valuing people on some transactional level, like, hello, Mr. Walking ATM, I am so thrilled to see you today. Boy, you are going to keep the lights on for another month. My goodness, I sure hope you're having a good day, right? As opposed to, hello, program sustaining human being that spends the time they could be spending anywhere down here with us. I brought flowers for you today, right? And it's about assigning a value to things that are not money, right? It's about like I think it was the Oregon Food Bank that started measuring a different metric. They started measuring the metric of love. And if you haven't read that article on the Community-Centric Fundraising Hub,
you have to read it. Yeah.
You have to read it, because there are other things to measure than just dollars, right? We can be measuring people's commitment to the organization. We can be measuring people's engagement with the organization. We can be measuring the amount of time people have given us as opposed to the amount of money, and then pull up a cultivation list of those folks instead of the high dollar folks, and go and chase them down and find out where else we can, deepen their engagement with the mission. And maybe that volunteer then has been saying, and I've been sitting on this little inheritance that my uncle gave me, and I don't really have any kids, and I was kind of thinking I'd give it to you guys maybe when I go. And then all of a sudden they're like a planned giving person, and not just that lovely volunteer that comes every week, right? All of that becomes possible when you stop measuring the value of people by dollars.
yes, I absolutely love that. Great examples. one last value that I just want to hit on before we get to talking about the article that you all wrote was we promote the understanding that everyone, donors, staff, funders, board members, volunteers, et cetera, personally benefit from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. I would love to get both your reactions to the term charity. I think it can be pretty damaging, and the traditional notions of charity are a lot that I hear you all, kind of pushing back against. So I would love to dig into this one for a minute. Michelle, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I hear the word charity, and I think the way most people use it, it's thinking that it's like a one-way transaction, right? Like you are doing something good to help someone, and like the majority of recognition for that is like you doing good. But like in reality, our futures are all so connected. And for me, like I tend to have more of like a Buddhist ideology on life and how things work. So this like makes perfect sense to me. Like nobody has to explain it to me. But if you don't have a Buddhist leaning towards life, I think that, one thing that really shows how connected we all are is like through the pandemic, right? Like you had an event happen on one side of the world, and then like all of our lives were affected for years and continuing to be affected. So, you supporting women's rights, for example, like it's not just for women, like it also like your future is also tied up into that. And I think that with this collective understanding of our symbiotic nature, that's to me like what that means. Like charity doesn't get to that because it really kind of speaks to you're a good person because you're trying to help other people. It's like, well, you're a good person, you're helping other people, but that also comes back to you in your world and benefits you as well.
Yeah, I think that, and you and I share a pretty similar worldview. And I think also that this time now, when our technology enables us to be in connection with the entire world, we can mobilize a global movement of people in basically no time flat, to make actual outcomes happen. One, I find just mentally staggering, but two, it means it's time to rethink this foolish notion of separation between us. It's becoming more and more and more obvious that we are all interconnected, that our outcomes are all tied up in each other's, and that our futures are intertwined. And that requires a different way of moving through the world. Right, it really does. One of my favorite books is Braiding Sweetgrass, and I really, Robin Wall Kimmerer, I really enjoy looking at the worldview in that book because it returns us to some indigenous knowledge about all of our interconnectedness, and connects that to how we operate right now here in our everyday urgent lives. Knowing that we're all one accident or injury or something away from personal, disaster, where our society feels like one election away from collapse. And that really begs the question of, all right, it's time to discard all of these notions that there are separate missions, that there is only one mission that we all share, right? We're just trying to uplift people and the world, and we're all coming at it from a very slightly different perspective, but we're all doing the same thing. And what I do to benefit you goes back and benefits Michelle, and then benefits me back, and it's all connected. Mm-hmm. And that mindset has to be in our fundraising as well. So it comes back to that fundraising, the development department is not immune, right, to all of the societal things happening. We shouldn't be. We shouldn't be, right? We're not selling a product. We're not, we're not businesses. We're working to uplift people. And that means we all just have to work together. I mean, I don't know how it seems kind of just cliche, but at the end of the day, none of these principles are surprising or new. They're all basically just common sense. It's just we seem to have gotten so far away from common sense. We need to come back.
It feels new again, like, whoa.
Right. Wow,
Yeah,
we should treat people kindly and like work together. I don't know. It seems like kindergarten. I swear I learned that somewhere.
Well, it's the fish underwater syndrome, right? They don't know that they're wet, or they don't know the water. Like, it's when we examine it externally like this, we can understand that, but it's so tough when you're steeped in those practices, which is why this type of conversation is so helpful. And as suspect, I know we're running short on time, but I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for everyone to hear a bit of the backstory behind the article that you both wrote together, the annual report that never was. Highly encourage everyone to check this out, about toxic positivity, and some of the harms created by traditional practices. Would love to just hear a bit about, how did this come up? How did you think about writing it? How did you decide to write it together? Michelle, what was the backstory?
Well, I think mainly it came out of just a spirited conversation with Marissa and myself. So if you ever have a chance to be in conversation with Marissa, I bet you too will also find a topic that's worthy of writing an article about. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend it. So I think that for us, like, we were thinking of annual reports as these products that we spend so much time on. I know, like, we have a lot of nonprofit friends on the call, right? Like, you guys know, like, we spend so much time on these products, and it's a little insane, right? And then, like, you have this product, and for me, I think what we were thinking was, you look at it and you were like, does this even represent anything of like who we are, what we did, or what we actually need? Because it feels very glossy, very positive, and we toot our own horn so much about this is what we've done. And ironically, because we use these so much as donor facing content, right? Ironically, like, in these materials, we don't even talk about what's our outstanding need. We always have outstanding need, and that's okay to have an outstanding need. Like, hey, you didn't solve your whole mission in 1 year, like, you shouldn't feel bad about that. That's fine. Like, so, and you can write about that. Like, here are things we want to do next. Like, here are things that excite us. Here's the challenges, or as Marcia said, the solvable problems we're tackling for 2023. Like, why don't we think like that? Like, why aren't we writing that kind of annual report? So that was the genesis of the energy that got us to that article.
Yeah, absolutely. Michelle and I were just chatting and solving all the world's problems, and and we were like, "What would it look like? What would it be like if we were just like brutally honest and like said the real stuff that actually happened?" And then we just started cracking each other up with all of the like hilariously true things that happen that never quite make it into that beautiful glossy report that we share our little statement of impact and all that. It's like so yeah, it's a lighthearted little read, but it is a poke at transparency and authenticity, and that it goes back to a lot of the principles. And let's try and be a little bit more honest with our donors. Let's try and be a little more honest with ourselves. Let's be a little more gentle with ourselves. Let's be a little nicer to our staffs. Let's work together some more and just do this good work a little bit better.
Yeah, and one of the themes that I pulled out of it, you talked about toxic positivity, and I think the annual report, I'm sure, is an outcome of toxic positivity, but that shows up in a lot of places, especially in fundraising and external facing conversations. Would you mind just naming some of the problems and the harms that are created from that kind of culture that people might not appreciate on the surface?
Well, it sets up this unrealistic fantasy world. And then you end up with staff with mental health problems because they can't ever live up to the fantasy that you're projecting as an organization. And it's demoralizing, and we're losing folks in this industry. It's not an easy industry to work in. We all know the hours are long, the pay is short. The rewards are often more emotional than financial, shall we say. right?
Yes, we shall.
Right, like, you know, and yeah, so it's encouraging authentic, transparent human conversations in an industry that often likes to gloss things over and pretend that problems aren't problems and sweep things under the rug in the name of achieving the mission. And the CCF movement is just saying that there's more than your mission.
And Michelle, is there a line for like being too honest? Like, when do you know, like, can you go too far and being too transparent in your donor funder communication?
I think so, right? Like, I think it's like akin to like people. I forget what the funny saying is, but is it like psychological safety? Is it give you the right, like, just to be an asshole to everyone in the workplace? Like, it's kind of the same thing, right? This is not like a free pass card of like, just say whatever you want, like, just be honest with all your problems. I do think there's a line, but one of the lines that we drew towards the end of this article was we need to be conscious of, like, in these reports, we are not only visualizing and representing our successes and oftentimes not the need, but also we're not including the community's voice in these. Like, what does the community think about our success? What does the community think it needs next? And I think that kind of need does need to be represented, because we never think about co-creating these annual reports with the people that we are serving and representing. And so we actually have a set of questions at the end of that article that we give you to think about before you do your next annual report. So depending on timing, maybe it's a good time for you and your team to look at those questions. But yeah, there is a line, but I think that we just need to step over the line. I think our fear right now is not getting too far towards the periphery. We just need to, like, enter the arena of a little more truth. That's where I'd love to see us go first.
Yeah, we're far enough away that we're not in danger of crossing the line.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know that we're coming up on 2 Eastern here in New York, but I just want to give a heartfelt thank you to Michelle and Marissa for joining us, and everyone else for tuning in. Amazing to have such a huge group. We had almost 50 people here most of the time. We will have this recording on Pond here in the next few days. So anyone who registered will show that. Please share that with your teams, maybe with some donors, and bring them into the conversation. And just be sure to check out all the other resources on Pond. Like I mentioned, those upcoming webinars with very connected conversations in the same vein. And just all the other ways you can use the platform to help your organization. So if you click the 3 buttons at the bottom, the 3 little dots, that'll pull up the webinar page and that project page to get started using Pond. So appreciate it, everybody. Thank you so much.